The morning sun cast long shadows across the crystal spires of Kepler 442b. As Ambassador Thera Moonwhisper stood before the emergency council chamber, her delicate hands trembled as she activated the quantum communication array, knowing this message would travel further than any Zelani had ever spoken before. The tall, graceful being looked nothing like the warriors of distant worlds, her deer-like features soft and peaceful, large dark eyes filled with tears that threatened to fall. 300 years of harmony on their world had never prepared the Zelani for this moment. Their cities grew from living trees, their technology worked with nature rather than against it, and their people had never raised a hand in violence against any living creature. Now death approached from the stars in the form of the Krex Dominion, and the Zelani had nowhere to turn except to species they had only heard about in distant transmissions. Thera activated the transmitter and began speaking in her melodic voice that carried the weight of 2 billion souls. She told the unknown listeners about her people, about their peaceful ways and their beautiful world where flowers sang in harmony with the wind. She explained how the Krex had come without warning, their massive ships blotting out the stars, their reptilian faces twisted with cruel hunger as they surveyed the defenseless planet below. The ambassador described the fate that awaited her people if no help came. The Krex Dominion was known throughout the galaxy for their brutal efficiency in conquest, taking entire populations as slaves and stripping worlds bare of resources before moving on to their next target. The Zelani had intercepted enough Krex communications to understand their plans, and the knowledge filled every peaceful heart with terror. Far across the galaxy, Commander Jake Morrison received the transmission at the Sol System Monitoring Station. The career military officer had spent 20 years watching the outer edges of human space, but he had never heard a plea quite like this one. His weathered face grew serious as he listened to the ambassador's gentle voice describing horrors that made his blood run cold. Morrison had fought pirates and raiders, but the Krex Dominion was something far worse. Morrison immediately forwarded the message to Earth Defense Command, where Captain Lisa Rodriguez reviewed the incoming intelligence reports. The data was grim beyond imagination. Over 200 Krex warships were gathering at the edge of the Kepler system, their plasma cannons capable of turning entire continents into glass. The Reptilian Empire had never been defeated in over 50 years of conquest, and their military doctrine was simple and effective. Rodriguez pulled up the files on Zelani society and felt her heart sink. These beings had no military tradition whatsoever. No weapons beyond gardening tools, no defensive systems beyond the natural barriers of their world. Their largest city housed 2 million civilians in structures made of living wood and crystal, beautiful but utterly vulnerable to orbital bombardment. The Zelani possessed incredible medical technology and could regrow entire forests in days, but they had never developed so much as a simple projectile weapon, the intelligence reports painted a clear picture of what would happen when the Krex arrived. The initial bombardment would target population centers to break resistance that did not exist. Ground forces would then sweep across the planet, sorting the population for various slave markets, while mining operations began stripping away everything of value. Within 6 months, the beautiful world of Kepler 442b would be a dead rock drifting in space. Admiral Ben Carter called an emergency session of the Earth Defense Council within hours of receiving the transmission. The gray-haired veteran had commanded fleets in 3 major conflicts, and he understood the stakes better than most. The council chamber filled quickly as representatives hurried to attend what everyone knew would be a historic meeting. The debate that followed was remarkably brief. Counselor Patricia Hayes argued for sending medical supplies and refugee ships to evacuate as many Zelani as possible. Counselor Robert Kim suggested diplomatic intervention, perhaps negotiating with the Krex for a peaceful resolution. General William Clark reviewed the military options and found them challenging but not impossible. Admiral Carter listened to all proposals before standing to address the chamber. His voice carried the authority of decades spent defending human space against those who would prey on the innocent. He explained that the Zelani had asked for humanitarian aid, for medical supplies and shelter for refugees, but such measures would only delay the inevitable. The Kreks would not be deterred by diplomacy, and evacuation ships could never save 2 billion beings from a fleet of that size. The Admiral's words echoed through the chamber as he delivered his decision. The Zilani had asked for help, and humanity would provide help, but not the kind they expected. Earth would not send doctors and relief workers to treat the symptoms of Krek's aggression. Instead, they would send soldiers to eliminate the disease entirely. The Council voted unanimously to approve Operation Guardian Shield, the largest military deployment since the Titan Wars. As the session ended, Admiral Carter remained behind to contemplate the magnitude of what they had just committed to undertake. The Zilani believed they were receiving humanitarian aid, gentle assistance from a species that shared their peaceful values. They had no idea that humanity's definition of humanitarian aid often came in the form of overwhelming military force, applied with surgical precision against those who threatened the innocent. The mobilization began before dawn across 12 human military installations scattered throughout the Sol system. Admiral Carter's orders had reached every major command center within hours, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The largest human fleet assembly since the war against the Cybernetic Collective began taking shape as hundreds of ships moved into formation around Earth's primary naval station. Captain Steve Harrison stood on the bridge of the UES Thunderstrike and watched as his task force assembled around the massive dreadnought. The ship stretched nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern, its hull bristling with weapon systems that could reduce entire cities to ash in minutes. Harrison had commanded the Thunderstrike through 3 major campaigns, but he had never led a force quite like the one gathering around him now. 12 heavy cruisers formed the backbone of the fleet, each one capable of independent operations and armed with enough firepower to level mountain ranges. 36 destroyers moved in perfect formation around the larger vessels, their sleek hulls designed for speed and precision strikes against enemy formations. 8 specialized assault carriers completed the task force, their holds filled with atmospheric fighters and orbital drop pods. Colonel Amy Foster reviewed her deployment orders aboard the assault carrier UES Valkyrie, while her soldiers prepared for what everyone knew would be a challenging mission. The 82nd Orbital Drop Division had earned their nickname during the brutal campaigns against the hegemony slavers, where they had perfected the art of precision warfare in urban environments. Every Marine in Foster's command was a veteran of at least 2 major operations, and their reputation preceded them wherever they went. Foster walked through the ship's armory and observed her soldiers preparing their equipment with the methodical precision that separated professionals from amateurs. Powered armor suits stood in neat rows, each one capable of withstanding direct plasma hits while enhancing the wearer's strength and speed beyond human limits. Weapon racks held rifles that could punch through armored vehicles and explosives powerful enough to collapse buildings. The colonel paused to speak with Master Sergeant Julie Parker, a 20-year veteran who had fought in more battles than most officers would see in their entire careers. Parker was checking the seals on her armor's life support system, knowing that orbital drops often required extended operations in hostile environments. Her weathered face showed no concern about the upcoming mission, only the focused concentration of someone who had survived by paying attention to every detail. Meanwhile, the Zilani continued sending updates to their supposed rescuers, completely unaware of the true nature of humanity's response. Ambassador Thira transmitted detailed maps of their major population centers, believing humans would need the information to establish medical stations and refugee camps. Her messages spoke of gratitude for the promised aid shipment and included cultural briefings to help human relief workers understand. Zilani Customs. Dr. Kevin Walsh spent the 3-week journey to Kepler 442b, studying everything the Zilani had shared about their society and finding himself increasingly amazed by their complete dedication to peaceful coexistence. The xenobiologist had worked with dozens of alien species, but he had never encountered a civilization that had evolved beyond violence so completely. The Zilani had no words in their language for concepts like murder or warfare, referring to such things only through translations from other species. The doctor briefed Foster's Marines during the journey, explaining that they would be protecting beings who had never harmed another sentient creature in their recorded history. The largest weapons the Zilani possessed were farming tools designed to harvest crops, and their cities had no defensive systems beyond natural barriers like rivers and mountains. Their entire approach to conflict resolution involved discussion and compromise, concepts that would be useless against the Krex Dominion. Captain Harrison received regular intelligence updates about enemy movements as the human fleet raced toward its destination. The Krex had positioned their invasion force just outside the Kepler system, waiting for optimal timing to begin their assault. Intercepted communications revealed that General Vorthik the Conqueror planned to begin orbital bombardment in 6 days, followed immediately by ground operations to secure the most valuable slaves. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Murphy studied the enemy fleet composition and found it both impressive and predictable. The Krex relied on overwhelming numbers and superior firepower to crush resistance before it could organize, a strategy that had worked perfectly against every opponent they had faced. 200 warships represented more combat power than most species could field in their entire military, and the Reptilian Empire had never encountered serious resistance to their expansion. The Krex battle plan followed their standard doctrine of terror and efficiency. Initial bombardment would target population centers and infrastructure, breaking any will to resist while demonstrating the futility of opposition. Ground forces would then land at key locations and begin sorting the population according to their value in various slave markets. The entire operation was scheduled to last less than 2 weeks. Murphy shared his tactical analysis with Foster and her officers, noting that the Krex expected no meaningful resistance from the Zilani defenders. Enemy intelligence reports described the target world as containing only peaceful farmers and artists, with no military capability whatsoever. The Reptilian commanders had allocated minimal resources for ground operations, expecting their troops to face nothing more dangerous than frightened civilians. As the human fleet approached the edge of the Kepler system, Captain Harrison ordered his ships into stealth configuration. The Thunderstrike and her escorts would arrive just 18 hours before the Krex invasion began, giving them barely enough time to deploy and prepare defensive positions. The timing would be critical as they needed to achieve tactical surprise, while ensuring they could protect all major Zilani population centers. Foster conducted final briefings with her unit commanders as they prepared for orbital deployment. The mission parameters were clear but challenging. They needed to eliminate a numerically superior enemy force while ensuring 0 civilian casualties, among a population that had no understanding of warfare. The Marines would be operating in urban environments filled with irreplaceable cultural sites, and 2 million beings who had never seen violence. The colonel emphasized that this operation would test everything the 82nd Orbital Drop Division had learned about precision warfare in complex environments. They would be fighting an enemy known for their brutality while protecting a species known for their gentleness, and failure was not an option. The reputation of humanity as protectors of the innocent rested on their ability to solve the Zilani crisis without becoming the monsters they were fighting against. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system with an energy discharge that registered on every sensor within 50 light-years. The massive vessels materialized in perfect formation, their arrival creating gravitational waves that rippled through space like thunder across the cosmos. On the Zilani monitoring station orbiting their homeworld, sensor operator Syra Stargazer nearly collapsed when her instruments detected the enormous energy signatures approaching their peaceful system. Syra had been monitoring deep space communications for over a decade, but she had never seen readings like these. The energy output from the arriving fleet exceeded anything in the Zilani database, suggesting vessels of impossible size and power. Her delicate hands shook as she transmitted the data to the Planetary Council, knowing that their rescuers had arrived but unable to understand why their ships seemed designed for warfare rather than humanitarian relief. Captain Harrison immediately established communication with the Zilani leadership from the bridge of the Thunderstrike. His weathered face appeared on screens throughout the crystal spires of the capital city as Ambassador Thera and the council elders gathered to welcome their saviors. The captain's military bearing and stern expression created immediate confusion among the assembled Zilani leaders, who had expected to meet gentle beings similar to themselves. Ambassador Thera stepped forward with a traditional Zilani greeting, her melodic voice carrying genuine warmth and gratitude as she welcomed the human relief mission to their world. She began listing coordinates for medical stations and supply distribution centers, explaining which areas had the greatest need for humanitarian assistance and where refugee camps should be established. Her large dark eyes shone with hope as she described the preparations her people had made to receive their rescuers. Harrison exchanged uncomfortable glances with his bridge crew as the ambassador continued her detailed briefing about medical needs and refugee logistics. Commander Tony Martinez, his communications officer, struggled to find diplomatic words to explain that the human fleet had not brought the supplies the Zilani expected. The captain finally interrupted Thyra's planning session to request immediate tactical information about cracks, positions, and defensive preparations. The Zilani reaction was immediate and profound confusion. Council Elder Prima Gentlehart asked why the relief workers needed information about enemy positions when their mission was to help injured civilians and establish safe zones for refugees. The elderly Zilani leader's gentle voice carried genuine bewilderment as she tried to understand why humanitarian workers would be interested in military intelligence about their enemies. Harrison realized that direct communication was necessary to avoid further misunderstandings. He activated the ship's main view screen and showed the Zilani leadership the true nature of their rescue fleet. Hundreds of warships stretched across the void, their hulls bristling with weapon systems that could reshape continents. Fighter squadrons moved in perfect formation around the larger vessels, while assault carriers prepared to launch their deadly cargo toward the planet below. The sight of humanity's military might created stunned silence in the Zilani council chamber. These beings had lived their entire lives without seeing anything more threatening than a farming tool, and now they found themselves staring at weapons of unimaginable destruction. Prima Gentleheart's voice trembled as she asked the question that filled every Zilani heart with growing dread about what kind of beings had answered their call for help. Colonel Foster's voice joined the conversation as her assault carriers began deploying toward the planet's surface. She spoke with professional courtesy but absolute authority as she explained that humanity had come to solve the Krex problem permanently. Her words carried the weight of someone who had fought dozens of battles and understood that sometimes the most humanitarian response was the complete elimination of those who threatened innocent lives. Dr. Sandra Kim attempted to bridge the cultural gap by explaining human military philosophy to the bewildered Zilani leadership. She described how humanity had learned through bitter experience that the best way to protect peaceful beings was to remove the threats they faced. The concept of using violence to preserve peace was completely foreign to Zilani thinking, but Kim tried to help them understand that some problems could only be solved through overwhelming force. Ambassador Thera's confusion turned to growing horror as she began to comprehend what humanity had sent in response to their plea for help. Her people had asked for doctors and relief supplies, gentle beings who would tend to the wounded and provide shelter for refugees. Instead, they had received the most terrifying military force they had ever encountered, warriors whose weapons could destroy their entire civilization in minutes on the planet's surface. Zilani civilians watched in amazement and terror as human dropships descended through their atmosphere like metallic shooting stars. The ships moved with purpose and precision that spoke of long experience in warfare, their hulls scarred from previous battles and their weapon systems tracking potential threats with mechanical efficiency. Every craft that landed brought soldiers whose armor looked more intimidating than anything in Zilani nightmares. The cultural shock was immediate and overwhelming for both species. The Zilani had imagined their rescuers would be similar to themselves, gentle healers who would arrive with medical equipment and kind words to comfort the frightened. Instead, they found themselves hosting warriors whose very presence transformed their peaceful world into something alien and threatening. Even though the humans had come to protect them, Foster's Marines began establishing defensive positions throughout the major population centers while trying to minimize their impact on Zilani society. Sergeant Pete Anderson's engineering teams installed automated defense systems that emerged from flower gardens and crystal formations, hiding weapons of incredible destructive power behind the natural beauty that defines Zilani architecture. The juxtaposition created a surreal landscape, where death and beauty existed side by side. The Zilani population struggled to process what they were witnessing as human soldiers transformed Crystal Falls into a fortress. Major Chris Johnson positioned heavy weapons teams in carefully selected locations that would provide maximum defensive coverage while preserving the city's most important cultural sites. His troops moved with practiced efficiency, but their presence filled every peaceful heart with questions about what kind of salvation they had received. Captain Linda Scott's reconnaissance units spread throughout the surrounding countryside, using advanced sensors to track incoming threats while trying to avoid disturbing the delicate ecosystems that the Zilani had carefully maintained for centuries. Her soldiers were professionals who understood the importance of their mission, but they also recognized that they were operating in a world where violence was completely unknown and their very presence was causing trauma among the beings they had come to protect. As the first day of human presence on Kepler 442b drew to a close, both species faced the challenge of understanding each other across a cultural divide that seemed impossible to bridge. The Zilani had received exactly what they asked for, help from a more advanced species, but the form that help had taken challenged everything they believed about civilization and the nature of intelligent life throughout the galaxy. The Krex Dominion fleet arrived at the edge of the Kepler system exactly on schedule, their massive formation blocking out stars as 200 warships moved in perfect synchronization toward their defenseless target. Admiral Scarth the Destroyer stood on the bridge of his flagship and surveyed the peaceful world below, already calculating how many slaves this conquest would provide, and how quickly his mining operations could strip away anything of value. The reptilian commander had led over 30 successful invasions during his career, and Kepler 442b promised to be one of the easiest. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Zilani possessed no military capability whatsoever, no defensive systems beyond natural barriers, and no weapons more dangerous than farming tools. Scarth expected to complete planetary pacification within days and have the first slave ships departing within 2 weeks. The Krex battle plan followed their standard doctrine of overwhelming terror followed by systematic exploitation. Initial orbital bombardment would target population centers to break any possibility of organized resistance while demonstrating the futility of opposing the Dominion. Ground forces would then secure key locations and begin sorting the population according to their value in various markets throughout reptilian space. Scarth activated his tactical display and began issuing orders for the bombardment to begin when his sensor operator suddenly reported massive energy signatures hiding behind the planet's largest moon. The Admiral's cold reptilian eyes narrowed as he realized that the supposedly defenseless world had somehow acquired defenders. The energy readings suggested a fleet of significant size and unknown capability positioned in perfect ambush formation. Captain Harrison received the sensor alert aboard the Thunderstrike and smiled grimly as he watched the Krex formation stumble into his carefully prepared trap. The human fleet had spent 18 hours positioning themselves for maximum tactical advantage, using the moon's gravity well to mask their presence while maintaining perfect firing solutions on the approaching enemy. Every ship in the task force was ready for combat, their weapons charged and targeting systems locked onto priority targets. The first engagement began when Harrison gave the order to open fire, and it lasted exactly 17 minutes from start to finish. The UES Thunderstrike's main gun spoke with the voice of controlled nuclear fusion, sending streams of coherent energy across the void to vaporize the Krex flagship in a single coordinated salvo. The massive Dreadnought's weapon systems had been designed to fight other capital ships, and Admiral Scarth's vessel simply ceased to exist under their focused attention. Human destroyers emerged from behind the moon like vengeful spirits, their advanced propulsion systems allowing them to accelerate faster than anything the Kreks had ever encountered. The sleek vessels moved through the enemy formation with deadly precision, their weapon systems systematically dismantling the reptilian fleet with surgical strikes against critical systems. Kreks commanders found themselves facing opponents who seemed to anticipate their every move. Commander Jake White led the fighter squadrons in a devastating attack against the Kreks carriers, his pilots moving with the precision that came from years of training and combat experience. The human fighters were faster and more maneuverable than anything in the reptilian arsenal, and their weapons could penetrate enemy armor that had withstood decades of galactic warfare. White's squadron alone accounted for 12 enemy vessels. In the first 10 minutes of combat, the Kreks fleet's numerical advantage meant nothing against opponents who had perfected the art of space warfare through centuries of conflict against various threats. Human tactical doctrine emphasized speed, precision, and overwhelming firepower applied at critical moments, principles that turned the reptilian formation into burning wreckage drifting through space. Of the 200 warships that had arrived to conquer a defenseless world, fewer than 30 escaped the initial engagement on the planet's surface. Colonel Foster's Marines prepared to receive the inevitable ground assault as Kreks drop pods began raining down from the few surviving enemy ships. The reptilian ground forces had been designed to terrorize helpless civilians and secure key installations against token resistance. But instead they found themselves facing the 82nd Orbital Drop Division deployed in full combat configuration. Throughout the major population centers. Major Chris Johnson positioned his heavy weapons teams in carefully selected locations throughout Crystal Falls, their advanced targeting systems tracking incoming enemy forces while automated defense turrets emerged from hidden positions throughout the city. The Zilani watched in fascination and terror as their beautiful capital transformed into a death trap for anyone foolish enough to threaten its inhabitants. The Kreks drop pods landed in parks and plazas throughout the city, disgorging reptilian warriors equipped with standard infantry weapons and expecting to face frightened farmers. Instead, they emerged into carefully prepared kill zones where human Marines waited with weapon systems that could penetrate armored vehicles. The reptilian soldiers had never encountered opposition like this, and their shock was complete and immediate. Sergeant Pete Anderson's engineering teams had spent hours preparing the battlefield, installing sensor networks and automated weapon systems that turned every street corner into a potential ambush site. The Kreks found themselves fighting an enemy who knew every inch of the terrain and had prepared contingencies for every possible approach. What should have been a simple occupation became a nightmare of coordinated defensive fire. Captain Linda Scott's reconnaissance units tracked enemy movements throughout the surrounding countryside, using advanced sensors and communication systems to coordinate defensive actions across multiple fronts. Her soldiers moved through the landscape like ghosts, appearing wherever the enemy was weakest and disappearing before retaliation could be organized. The Kreks ground commanders quickly realized they were facing professionals who had turned warfare into an art form. The battle for Kepler 442b lasted exactly 4 hours from the moment the first Kreks boots touched the ground until Master Sergeant Julie Parker reported the final casualty count to Colonel Foster. Every reptilian soldier who had landed on the planet was either dead or captured, their equipment destroyed and their mission objectives completely failed. The human casualties numbered 0, and more importantly, not a single Zilani civilian had been harmed during the urban combat. Foster walked through the streets of Crystal Falls after the battle and observed the strange mixture of relief and confusion on every Zilani face she encountered. These beings had watched their world transform into a battleground and witnessed violence on a scale they could barely comprehend, yet somehow they remained completely unharmed. The human Marines had fought a major engagement in the heart of their city without causing any collateral damage. Elder Prima Gentleheart approached Colonel Foster with tears streaming down her gentle face, her large dark eyes filled with emotions she could not fully express. The elderly Zilani leader had lived her entire life without witnessing violence, and the events of the past few hours had shattered her understanding of how conflicts could be resolved. She struggled to find words that could convey her gratitude. To beings who had saved her people in ways she had never imagined possible, the aftermath of the battle left both species contemplating the magnitude of what had just occurred. The Krex Dominion had suffered their first major defeat in over 50 years of conquest, their reputation for invincibility shattered by a species they had never encountered. The Zilani found themselves completely safe but struggling to understand how their rescuers had achieved such total victory while protecting every innocent life on their world. As the last Krex survivors fled the system in damaged ships, Captain Harrison began the process of securing the planet and establishing long-term defensive positions. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but the larger implications of humanity's intervention were just beginning to unfold as word of the battle spread throughout the galaxy. The days following the battle brought a strange quiet to Kepler 442b, as both species struggled to understand what had just occurred. Technical Sergeant Dan Phillips led cleanup operations throughout Crystal Falls using human technology to repair battle damage that would have taken the Zilani months to heal with their biotechnology. Plasma burns on crystal spires disappeared under molecular repair tools, and crater-marked streets were restored to their original beauty within hours. Dr. Kevin Walsh established cultural exchange centers throughout the major population centers, attempting to bridge the enormous gap between human and Zilani worldviews. The xenobiologist had worked with dozens of alien species during his career, but he had never encountered a challenge quite like helping a completely peaceful civilization understand why violence had been necessary to preserve their existence. Ambassador Thera spent long hours in conversation with Captain Harrison, trying to comprehend the philosophical framework that allowed humans to be both gentle and terrifyingly destructive. The Zilani diplomat struggled with concepts that seemed contradictory to her people, particularly the human belief that military strength served peace rather than destroying it. Her melodic voice carried genuine confusion as she asked how beings capable of such devastating warfare could also ensure that no innocent lives were lost during urban combat. The revelation that shocked the Zilani most deeply came when they learned about human history through conversations with the Marine units stationed throughout their cities. Corporal Alex Turner shared stories about Earth's wars with groups of curious Zilani civilians, explaining how humanity had developed both nuclear weapons and classical music during the same historical periods. The concept of a species that could create both symphony orchestras and orbital bombardment platforms was completely foreign to Zilani thinking. Elder Prima Genelhart organized daily meetings with Colonel Foster, seeking to understand the moral framework that guided human military decisions. The elderly Zilani leader asked difficult questions about how soldiers could maintain their humanity while engaging in actions that her species found incomprehensible. Foster's patient explanations about duty, honor, and the protection of innocence gradually began to make sense to the peacekeepers. Though the concepts remained alien to their experience, the Zilani children adapted to the human presence with the flexibility that characterized young minds, approaching the armored Marines with curiosity rather than fear. Sergeant Kelly Brown found herself surrounded by youngsters who wanted to understand how her powered armor worked and why humans needed such powerful weapons. Her gentle explanations about the difference between protecting and threatening helped bridge the cultural gap in ways that formal diplomatic meetings could not achieve. Captain Mary Robinson's intelligence team shared captured Krex databases with the Zilani leadership, providing irrefutable evidence of what the Dominion had planned for their world. The detailed records of systematic exploitation and population enslavement painted a picture of horror that the peaceful beings could barely comprehend. The Zilani finally understood that their pacifist nature would have meant nothing to enemies who viewed them only as resources to be harvested. The intelligence files revealed the true scope of Krex operations throughout the galaxy, documenting dozens of conquered worlds that had suffered the fate Kepler 442b had avoided. Peaceful species throughout reptilian space had been reduced to slavery or extinction, their worlds stripped bare and turned into industrial centers for the Dominion's continued expansion. The Zilani realized they had narrowly escaped becoming. Another entry in this catalog of atrocities. Dr. Sandra Kim worked with Zilani healers to treat the psychological trauma that many civilians experienced after witnessing large-scale violence for the first time in their species' history. The human medical officer discovered that the Zilani possessed remarkable resilience, but their lack of any cultural framework for understanding warfare made the healing process particularly challenging. Many Zilani struggled with nightmares about explosions and weapons they had never imagined could exist. As human forces prepared for eventual departure, the Zilani leadership faced profound philosophical questions about their place in a galaxy that operated according to rules they had never understood. Their entire civilization was built on principles of nonviolence and cooperation, yet they owed their continued existence to humanity's willingness to use overwhelming force against those who threatened innocent lives. The cultural exchange programs revealed fascinating differences between the two species' approaches to problem solving. Humans had developed technology primarily through military competition and the need to overcome hostile environments, while the Zilani had achieved their advances through cooperation and harmony with natural systems. Both approaches had produced remarkable results, but they reflected completely different assumptions about the nature of existence. Lieutenant Sam Davis documented the gradual changes in Zilani society as they absorbed the reality of their situation. While the vast majority remained committed to their peaceful traditions, a small minority began asking questions about self-defense and the responsibilities that came with knowledge of galactic realities. These conversations were difficult for both species, as they touched on fundamental questions about the nature of civilization and survival. The philosophical crisis facing the Zilani centered on a question that had never occurred to them before: the human intervention. Elder Prima Gentlehart expressed the dilemma during one of her conversations with Captain Harrison, asking how her people could thank someone for saving them in a way they had never wanted to be saved. The question highlighted the fundamental difference between asking for help and receiving the help you actually needed. Foster's Marines began preparing detailed defensive plans for the Zilani leadership, knowing that humanity could not maintain a permanent garrison on every peaceful world threatened by aggressive neighbors. The colonel explained that the best long-term security came from the ability to defend oneself, even if that capability was never actually used. The concept of deterrence through strength was foreign to Zilani thinking, but gradually began to make sense. As news of the battle spread throughout the galaxy, the Zilani found themselves receiving communications from other peaceful species who faced similar threats. The victory over the Krex Dominion had created ripple effects across known space, as predatory civilizations suddenly realized that attacking defenseless worlds might no longer be a safe strategy. The Zilani began to understand that their rescue had implications far beyond their single world. The relationship between humans and Zilani evolved from confusion and fear toward something approaching mutual respect. The peaceful beings remained committed to their nonviolent principles, but they gained an appreciation for those willing to bear the moral burden of violence in defense of innocence. Humanity discovered a species whose dedication to peace was both admirable and fragile, requiring protection from a galaxy that did not share their values. The final days of the human military presence on Kepler 442b were marked by ceremonies that honored both species' contributions to their unlikely partnership. The Zilani offered gifts of rare flowers and crystal formations, while the humans left behind communication systems and defensive sensors that would provide early warning of future threats. Both species recognized that they had been changed by their encounter in ways that would shape their future development. 3 months after the battle that saved their world, Ambassador Thera Moonwhisper stood in the United Nations building on Earth, surrounded by the representatives of a species she was still learning to understand. The ancient chamber had witnessed countless historic moments, but few as significant as the formal signing of the Human-Zilani Mutual Defense Treaty that would reshape both civilizations and send ripples throughout the known galaxy. Admiral Ben Carter explained the treaty terms. in simple language that both species could understand completely. Humanity would guarantee Zilani independence and provide military protection against any future threats, while Earth would gain access to advanced Zilani, biotechnology, and medical knowledge that could revolutionize human healthcare. The agreement represented more than mutual benefit, however, as it established a new model for cooperation between warrior and peaceful species. The most controversial aspect of the treaty was humanity's offer to provide military training for Zilani volunteers who wished to learn defensive warfare. The concept created heated debates throughout Zilani society, as many questioned whether their species should abandon centuries of pacifist tradition to embrace the methods that had saved them. Elder Prima Genelhart supported the program, arguing that understanding violence might be necessary to prevent it. The first class of Zilani military cadets arrived at the Mars Defense Academy 6 weeks later, creating considerable culture shock for both instructors and students. General Amy Foster, promoted after her successful command during the Kepler crisis, watched as 20 young Zilani struggled to understand the basic principles of combat while maintaining their gentle nature. The sight of deer-like beings learning to use plasma rifles challenged assumptions on both sides. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Murphy adapted human training methods to accommodate students who had never witnessed aggression in any form. The Zilani cadets approached military tactics with the same methodical intelligence they applied to agriculture and medicine, but they struggled with concepts like acceptable casualties and collateral damage. Their questions often forced human instructors to examine their own assumptions about warfare and its moral implications. The cultural exchange worked both ways, as human soldiers learned about Zilani approaches to conflict resolution and cooperative problem-solving. Sergeant Pete Anderson discovered that Zilani techniques for ecosystem management could be applied to military logistics, while Captain Linda Scott found that their communication methods improved coordination between different units during complex operations. Captain Steve Harrison established the permanent Earth Defense Garrison at Kepler 442b, commanding a reduced but capable force designed to provide early warning and initial response to future threats. The human presence had become a reassuring constant for the Zilani population, who had grown comfortable with their protectors. Despite initial fears about their military nature, the changes in Zilani society were subtle but significant as they adapted to their new understanding of galactic realities. While the vast majority remained committed to their peaceful traditions, they developed new appreciation for those willing to serve as guardians. A small but growing minority of young Zilani began expressing interest in careers that involved protecting others, whether through military service or diplomatic security. Dr. Kevin Walsh documented the philosophical evolution occurring throughout Zilani culture as they grappled with questions their species had never needed to consider. The integration of human concepts about defensive violence and deterrence created new schools of thought that maintained peaceful principles while acknowledging the need for protection against those who would exploit such values. The success of the human-Zilani partnership began attracting attention from other peaceful species throughout the galaxy who faced similar threats from aggressive neighbors. The gentle folk of Kepler 438c requested assistance against raiders who had been attacking their trading vessels, while the crystal builders of the Vega system sought protection from a mining consortium that wanted to strip their sacred mountains. Each new request for aid followed the same pattern that had defined humanity's first intervention. Peaceful species asked for humanitarian assistance, medical supplies, or diplomatic intervention, and humanity responded by sending soldiers equipped to eliminate the threats permanently. The galaxy slowly learned that when humans promised to help, they kept that promise by addressing root causes rather than symptoms. The Krex Dominion's defeat had sent shockwaves throughout the reptilian empire and beyond, as predatory species realized that attacking defenseless worlds was no longer a guaranteed victory. Several aggressive civilizations began reconsidering their expansion plans. When intelligence reports confirmed that humanity was willing to intervene on behalf of peaceful species anywhere in known space, Lieutenant Sam Davis established the interspecies cultural exchange program to help bridge the gap between human military personnel and the various peaceful species they protected. The program paired human soldiers with civilian representatives from allied worlds, creating relationships that help both sides understand each other's perspectives and values. The program's most successful pairing involved Sergeant Kelly Brown and a young Zilani named Lyra Star Whisper, who had volunteered to serve as a cultural ambassador. Their friendship demonstrated how beings from completely different backgrounds could find common ground in their shared desire to protect innocent lives, even when they disagreed about methods. As the first year of the alliance drew to a close, both species reflected on how much they had changed through their partnership. The Zilani had not abandoned their peaceful nature, but they had gained something their species had never possessed before: the ability to choose peace from a position of security rather than vulnerability. The relationship reached its symbolic culmination in a scene that perfectly captured the new reality both species had created together. In Crystal Falls, a Zilani child approached a human Marine on patrol, offering Sergeant Brown a flower grown in the family garden. The soldier knelt to accept the gift, her armored hands gentle as they received the delicate bloom. Brown reflected on the journey that had brought both species to this moment. As she carefully placed the flower in her helmet's storage compartment, the Zilani had asked for humanitarian aid and received soldiers, yet those soldiers had proven to be the greatest humanitarian aid humanity could offer. The flower represented something new in the galaxy, a friendship between warriors and healers, strength and gentleness, violence and peace. The final report from Captain Harrison to Earth Defense Command captured the broader implications of their intervention. News of humanity's protective stance was spreading throughout known space, carried by traders and diplomats who had witnessed the transformation of galactic power dynamics. Other peaceful species were beginning to send similar requests for aid, each one confident that humanity would respond to threats against innocent lives. The galaxy was learning a fundamental truth about human nature that would reshape interstellar relations for generations to come. When humanity promised to help, they kept that promise completely and permanently. They simply did it their own way, with overwhelming force applied precisely against those who threatened the peace that others cherished. The age of easy conquest was ending, replaced by an era where peaceful species could thrive under the protection of guardians, who understood that sometimes the most humanitarian response was the complete elimination of those who preyed upon the innocent.